All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Leslie, are you? Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Paul, Managing Vice President at Parveda Solutions, and I'm pleased to be your moderator. On behalf of all my colleagues at Parveda across the US and Canada, welcome to the webinar and thank you for joining us. Today, we're excited to hear from Dr. Gerry Kraines, the author of the book Management Productivity Multipliers, and Denis Turcotte, the COO of Brookfield Asset Management's private equity group. Among those of you listening, I know we've got a mix of clients, associates, friends, and I think there's some family. Many of you know Gerry or Denis or both. However, there are some in the audience who don't know either. And I'd like you to understand the depth of experience that we're going to hear from these two luminaries today. So Dr. Gerry Kraines brings more than 40 years of consulting around strategic organization transformation. He began his career as a practicing psychiatrist before becoming the medical director at a regional mental health center and served on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for many years. At some point, Gerry began to realize that many of the challenges his clients were bringing to him as a psychiatrist stemmed from organizational and leadership issues in the workplace. And in his search for a solution, he found Harry Levinson at the Harvard Business School and the founder of the Levinson Institute. Gerry wound up working with Harry for a number of years and then succeeded Harry as CEO and has carried on teaching the leadership lessons that he learned. During his time at the Levinson Institute, he also found Elliot Jaques and integrated some of his thinking into strategic organization. Dr. Kraines has led executive level international seminars, served as a consultant and an executive coach. He's guided companies through reorganizations resulting from rapid growth, acquisitions, mergers, consolidations. And then in 2019, Levinson joined forces with Parveda after a decade-long relationship. So Parveda is a management and technology consultancy, and both Levinson and Parveda share a goal of developing people to their fullest potential. This past January, Gerry published his second book, Management Productivity Multipliers, Tools for Accountability, Leadership, and Productivity. Please join me in congratulating Gerry for producing not just one book, but two. Most of us, including me, are still trying to figure out what the first one is going to be. Our second distinguished speaker, Denis Turcotte, is a managing partner and COO of Brookfield's private equity group. He's responsible for business operations. Brookfield is an alternative asset management firm with $600 billion in assets under management. In a 2006 Canadian Business article, Denis gave us a little bit about his background. He said he came from a hardworking French-Canadian family. His dad owned a trucking company, and as a kid, he spent weekends at the garage changing tires and oil and generally getting dirty. There he developed an interest in all things mechanical, later pursuing an engineering degree before attending business school. Once he got into the workplace, Mr. Turcotte rose through the ranks quickly and was at Tembec until he became president of its paper group. And then he went to become the CEO of Algoma Steel. And I think that was when you were 30? Is that correct? Or were you older than that?
That was 40. I was 40.
Okay. I skipped a few years. At Algoma, he and his team achieved a successful turnaround. And then he joined Brookfield in 2017 after serving as a member of its advisory board for 10 years. Denis has received numerous honors, including the Engineering Medal in Management from the Professional Engineers of Ontario, CEO of the Year by Canadian Business Magazine, and the 40 Under 40 Award from Caldwell Partners. To give you a sense of how passionate Denis is about strategic organization, I'm going to quote him directly. And I quote, "Having gone through strategic organization training many times and having practiced by implementation in real life over the past 25 years, I believe this is the most important and typically missing body of knowledge that any CEO who wants to compete at a world-class level needs to have. I know a bold statement. It is, as calculus is to engineering and quantum mechanics is to particle physics, i.e., without this fundamental organizational science, all efforts related to organizational development are tribal at best. It's a bold statement indeed, and not an isolated one. It's been impressive over this past year for me to see Gerry in action, and dare I say the adoration that his clients feel for him and for Cincy, his wife, and the value they find in strategic organization. And I say that from the bottom of my heart. It has been truly impressive to watch. To give you a sense of these two men's relationship, Gerry and Denis have worked together for 3 decades now, with Denis as Gerry's client, friend, and partner in crime. Gerry devotes a chapter in his book to the lessons he's learned from Denis around leadership. And for Denis's part, I've heard him call Gerry a mentor more than once. So we expect today's conversation to be lively and informative. Couple of logistical notes before we get started. Both Gerry and Denis are busy people, and we appreciate the time that we are getting from them. They do have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so we will be ending promptly. And then from a questions perspective, we are going to try and leave some time at the end for Q&A. However, you feel free to type in questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go. If we can't get to your questions, then we'll capture them and answer them in a follow-up email. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, gentlemen. My first set of questions are going to be for Gerry. So Gerry, tell us a bit more of how you got into leadership consulting.
Well, first of all, thank you for that generous introduction, Susan. I appreciate it. My initial interest as a physician and a psychiatrist was to promote healthy working conditions for people in the workplace. Too often, my clients, whether they were executives, managers, or people working on the shop floor, complained to me how difficult it was to be successful in their roles. They often complained that they had to spend more time working the system just to be able to get their work done, and they were very inefficient. Often they were held accountable for things for which they didn't have the authority or the resources, which created enormous stress. And from the organization's point of view, their expectations ended up being in fantasy land. So my first instinct was to blame all of this on poor leadership. But as I began to look into it, I became increasingly convinced that the organization itself often induced ineffective leadership. And that led me on a journey, given my medical roots, to better understand the anatomy and physiology of managerial systems and to discover how accountability rendered properly can promote trust and fairness rather than to break it down. I had a great mentor in a fellow by the name of Dr. Elliot Jacks, who was an engineer, a physician, a research psychologist, who went on to spend 60 years investigating what Denis and I joke as the physics and engineering of leadership systems. And this ultimately led to what my book is about, strategic organization, and a comprehensive leadership system technology that we call Scenario.
Talk a little more, Gerry, if you would, about strategic organization. So for those that are on the call that may not know anything about it.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's evidence-based. It's not wild theory. It's a proven system for creating exceptional value that's based on these engineering principles and can be applied by managers at every level of the organization. And it provides a pragmatic blueprint, if you will, for aligning every aspect of the organization with strategy, structure, processes, systems, people, leadership. And at the end of the strategic organization process, we end up having accountable market-centric business units. We have value-adding managerial levels. We are able to support capable, efficient, and accountable processes, ensure that we have capable, motivated people in roles for which they're qualified, who have clear accountabilities and the requisite authorities, and that all of this is held together by value-adding accountability leaders who leverage the full potential of their people.
Dennis, ask, how do you see strategic organization?
Well, I think Gerry described it well. I guess I relate it to my engineering training. You know, in second year engineering, a mandatory course is referred to as dynamic systems. And what that basically is, it teaches you how to look at any system, a collection of many parts, but all that have to be linked and synchronized together in some way. And it teaches you how to think about that, and then ultimately how to model it mathematically so you can start to do optimum design. And that stuck with me my entire life. And as an amateur student of individual behavior and organizational behavior, you can't help but notice the similarities around what I refer to as human dynamic systems, i.e. the individual behavior and the collective behavior are linked, and there's no way around that. Well, when I first got exposed to strategic organization, it immediately appealed to me, this systematic, structured way of thinking about organizations as living, breathing entities, and the need to understand the basic subsets of how organizations are structured, how they interrelate, and that how by just simply changing structure, not even changing the people in the roles, but by changing structure, you could produce different outcomes with the same parts. By then changing the accountabilities of each role, again, not even changing people yet, but by changing the accountabilities over the various business processes, you can induce different levels of performance. To then add that last piece, which is around how to size up individuals to make sure you got a more precise fit for role, the whole thing comes together. So to me, it's about systems optimization at a very engineering-like way. And the power, the thing that in fact impacted me, again, as probably a lifelong student of behavior, an amateur in that regard, but genuinely interested and observant of people and why they did what they did and why when you put them together in certain ways, they do what they do. To then have this engineering-like insight and set of frameworks to apply, it just instantaneously gelled with me, and it transformed the way I approached all things to do with organization.
And I really liked the way you described the engineering aspect of it, because I know we talk about the organizational science a lot, but I think you really nailed it there. So thank you on that end. Go back to Gerry. How does a strategic organization, how do you relate it to the comment you often make about accountability without authority is fantasy and stress?
Well, to begin to get the root of that, we need to understand that at its core, managerial systems are accountability hierarchies. The problem is most people equate hierarchy with bureaucracy and command and control. While that's true of bad hierarchy, where people are set up to fail, it's not true of good hierarchy. Good hierarchy sets people up to succeed. It not only gives them clarity about what they're accountable for, but it engages them through effective two-way managerial context setting with why they're working on what they're doing, what the end goal is, so they can be informed by the ultimate organization's objectives. And they are expected to communicate with their managers the requisite authorities and resources they need so that they can truly exercise judgment and discretion. They're not in a command and control, do as I say, check your brain at the door.
Dennis, I'm going to ask you a question on just good hierarchies and bad hierarchies, since I would assume you've seen quite a bit of both, and you had to move from one to the other. What does that look like?
Well, look, no, absolutely. I've seen the whole range. You know, it's funny as I think about your question. You often run into situations where other people involved at a leadership level will look down at the situation and say, our problem is we have too many people, we have too much overhead, It's a bureaucracy. We simply have to cut out people. And often in other situations, I've run across people that will simply, from the other point of view, simply say, look, we just don't have enough people. Everybody's being pushed too hard. They're working in a way where they just can't get the work done. And I guess as I think about this from a systems point of view, I've been both taught and experience has confirmed to me that it's very situational and that you really need to have a disciplined and structured approach at looking down at each situation. And if you have a framework, which strategic org absolutely brings to bear, which is around first trying to understand the complexity of the situation. In a for-profit context, we call that a business. But this is equally applicable to any non-for-profit organization that has a serious mission in my mind as well. But sticking with a for-profit situation, it's about looking down at the situation at hand, understanding the organization, how you find it today, what's its competitive environment, what's the strategy it's implicitly or explicitly chosen to execute, and then just trying to put a pin in on the answer to the question, how complex is this situation? Hence, how does this organization need to be structured to deal with that level of complexity? And in parallel, it's understanding that if you have a company in a level 7 situation, as an example, to extend my analogy, well, by definition, you need a level 7 organization, i.e., you need 7 levels between the shop floor and the CEO. You don't need 8. You can't live with 6. So being informed by these engineering-like understandings and frameworks, you can start to size up accurately. You can start to design for intent, and it just flows from there.
I think why don't we start with Gerry on this one briefly? Question about just the complexity. Denis mentioned complexity and he mentioned levels, which may be a new concept to people. Not the idea that there is complexity or that there are levels, but in strategic organization, it has a very specific meaning.
Well, this is one of the foundational principles discovered by Elliott Jackson in the 1950s, when he discovered a way to accurately measure the degree of complexity of work of a role. And when he applied that to hierarchies, going from the CEO down to the shop floor, he discovered that while complexity decreases when you go from top to bottom, or conversely increases from the bottom to the top, at certain degrees of complexity, the nature of work changed. The nature of thinking required changed. And from that, he discovered that the most complex organizations in the world really only have 8 discrete different levels of complexity. So when I was working with Ford in the early 90s, and they were trying to figure out whether they needed 14 levels like GM or 13 like they had or 11 like Toyota, using this measuring instrument, I was able to come back and say, you can have as many levels as you want as long as it's 8. My high school science teacher used to say about science, it's easy to walk on water once you know where the rocks are. And that's what these engineering principles allow. But there are measurably 8 different types of human thought process that correspond to these naturally occurring 8 levels of work complexity.
Denis, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think I would be repeating Gerry, and the biggest frustration, as you made in your opening comments about me, especially at this stage of my career, probably one of the biggest frustrations is if senior people in organizations would force themselves to take the time to understand enough. This is not a trivial topic of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So you need to invest some time in an open mind to receive and consider this knowledge. But if you don't, everything is ad hoc and based on experience and benchmarking. And I'm not saying those kind of things don't help CEOs do great work. Obviously, there are many well-run companies in the world by CEOs who have not even heard of requisite or strategic organization. But the point is, there is so much mediocrity out there. I mean, let's face it, that's what we within a big private equity business do. How can a bunch of financial people walk into a situation and buy a business that might be 100 years in the running, and all of a sudden within 24 months, it's running at 30% incremental free cash flow? That's got nothing to do with leverage, which is what everybody accuses private equity as having. The only trick is they just lever things up, pay debt down, and then they exit. That's not what we do at Brookfield. We add genuine value at the core of these businesses. And it's part of why, to be honest, I decided to come back to work a few years ago, is because I care a lot about this company, and I genuinely believe I'm instilling a sustainable competitive advantage into our operating teams here. And in a way, the good news is, because most people don't have the attention span or the curiosity to try to discover it, it's a bit of a frustration for me on a personal level, but it's an absolute competitive advantage that we're trying to instill within Brookfield.
Right, right. Now that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to shift gears a minute and go back to the book. So, Gerry, why did you write Management Productivity Multipliers? And can you tell us a little bit about what we should expect to learn?
Well, my first book came out 2001, was called Accountability Leadership. And I was still relatively new to the model and the work. And it was written more like a textbook laying out the theory and sort of a high level guide to implementation. This book now incorporates 20 years of additional experience I've had that allows me to explain the methodology in a much more pragmatic and accessible manner. When I first began working with Denis, he was the best possible student. He crossed every T, dotted every I. But what I've learned from him, especially when you're in a private equity mode or you're in owner mode and you want to get value back, you need to go to the 80-20 rule and apply those principles to the areas that need it most. And so I've tried to capture that in this book. But it basically addresses 4 of these subsystems that Denis referred to. The nature of accountability. The dilemma that most managerial systems face is they're struggling between the need to deploy and unleash creative initiative on the one hand, but the need to have sustainable, safe, repeatable processes on the other. And the tension between freeing people up to be creative and ensuring we have process control usually results in fads that go from one extreme to the other of the pendulum. It took me 3 or 4 years to realize that accountability should not mean who do we blame when something goes wrong. That when people make a commitment, they need to make an honest commitment, which means unless they come back and renegotiate it, they're on the hook for what they committed to do. They're not only on the hook for the output, they're on the hook to adhere to process standards and limits. But just conforming to your commitments doesn't create value by itself. We still need to harness human judgment and initiative. And that has to do with how effectively they overcome obstacles, how effectively they're able to identify and exploit opportunities. And that's really the thinking part. But we can't measure that as much as we can measure outputs and throughputs, but we can judge how effectively any one employee is filling the intended range of value for a role. So a major part of our work is to implement internally consistent assessments of how effectively people fill their roles, and we tie rewards to the value people create and deliver. So one part of the book is about accountability. The second part is about leadership. And I don't really find the exercise that many business schools use very interesting. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? Because I believe all managers should be held accountable for exhibiting value-adding managerial leadership. So the question is, what is leadership? And I think it's two things. It's setting direction, and that requires understanding the complexities of your work, as Denis talked about, and then leveraging the potential of your resources to achieve that direction. And it took me, again, another few years to really simplify the major tasks of managerial leadership as it relates to leveraging potential. If people are not enthusiastically engaged to apply their judgment, their knowledge, their skill to create value for the organization, you're not going to harness any of their potential. So the first in the acronym of LEAD, of leveraging potential, is engaging commitment. But if people are only enthusiastic, then we have empowerment. And I'm sure many of you remember the chaos of the mid to late 90s where everything was empowerment. Just do the right thing. Get rid of the over-controlling managers. Well, the problem is we want people to apply their judgment and discretion, not to do whatever they want to do, but to do the work, complete their assignments in a way that optimally supports the organization's overarching goals. And for that to occur, every manager has to set continuing, ongoing two-way context to help their people understand not only what they're accountable for doing, but why. What is the higher level problem that we're asking them to help solve? So it's not enough just to get something done. You need to do it and apply your judgment in a way that supports the overarching goals. And the D in LEAD is we may have people who have the potential to be effective, but if they don't have the knowledge and skill and the proper mindset to really fully leverage their brain power and their potential, it's still not going to be fully leveraged. So I found it very useful to reduce the secret of the leveraging aspect of leadership is LEAD, leverage potential, engage commitment, align judgment, develop capabilities. So that's why I wrote the book.
That's why you wrote the book. Okay. And I think you've really explained a lot of how all those productivity multipliers fit together. Is there anything else you would add?
Well, as Denis already said, we present the physics and engineering of organizational alignment, and we've discussed that already. But there's also an aspect of the human system, and so we've developed really rigorous talent assessment, development, deployment systems that really tie all of this together. And we're often asked, how does it tie together? And I keep thinking of that old song, you know, the foot bone's connected to the shin bone and the shin bone's connected to the thigh bone, so on and so forth. What I tried to do in this book is demonstrate not only the value of each subsystem developed optimally, but the exponential value creation by virtue of the synergies that occur when you leverage all of them together. So that's why I wrote this book.
Something you just said triggered a different question. This is probably more for Denis. The sort of earn your keep your word, and the path to holding people accountable in an organization that didn't come from that. What does that look like as you move people to realizing they are accountable?
To me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think to use some of the strategic organization terminology, I think it starts with making sure from the top down, from the CEO on down, CEO and his or her deputies working with each one-on-one to make sure they understand what are the fixed commitments needed out of the job? I.e., what are those accountabilities that are truly non-negotiable? They need to be met as a minimum at a certain level. And I think that's where you start to set, the standards of performance. And then understanding that there are other commitments that are by definition variable, i.e., another way to think of it or frame it is when people say, you have an accountability to work inside the box and think outside the box, i.e., as you apply yourself to getting more and more of whatever you're trying to achieve, uh, as you're trying to create value in a business context, it's about meeting those fixed commitments as a minimum and then developing value as you work on those variable commitments, as you think outside the box, and as you bring that thinking to bear in a context of business. If you don't have authority over it, uh, but obviously you're contributing to that thinking, that's value added. And that's the difference, in a simple term of between B players and A players, as we simplify it, right? Because in the context of business, often you need to move fast. You need to make these judgments following Pareto's law, the 80-20. You don't have the luxury of time and precision. So you need to be able to assess things quickly, including people. And in that vein, there's truly, to me, there's kind of an ABC set of filters, and people very quickly fit into one of those three categories. Now, everybody can be positioned in a way to do better than they are today. I genuinely believe that in the spirit of continuous improvement. But when you have to make quick decisions, you do have to make these judgments and you make decisions. And the difference, the fundamental difference when I talk to people that I work with about the portfolio companies post closing on a deal, when we go in to try to move quickly, we need to make these judgments. And these are tough and stressful judgments because, frankly, if you're not stressed by it, you're not a human being. You're affecting people's lives by the decisions you're going to make. But these frameworks are very straightforward to teach and then deploy. And the difference, and it's observable after over 30 years of work between A players and B players, there tends to be a constant set of aspects of those individuals that makes them different. And it's ironic because very few people we've interacted with have any strategic organization training. They don't understand what this body of knowledge is or what the language means, but A players consistently have the attributes that we would define with strategic organization in a very particular way. They understand their fixed commitments. They naturally find a way of understanding them, and they drag it out of their boss if they have a weak managerial boss, or they act very responsibly to find what are those fixed commitments. They then naturally gravitate to trying to add value by thinking outside the box, by interacting with their teammates, their deputies, their boss, trying to constantly add value. Point is, natural A players have all of these attributes, but they are by definition a small set of the normal distribution in a random way. What strategic organization training allows is you to bring a language and a way of thinking about work where even the mere mortals amongst us end up elevating their game. And it was not, it was theoretical when I first got exposed to it. But as I started to put it into practice, different company after different company after different company, always for some reason in turnaround situations, either I was drawn to or people reached out to me. But at the end of the day, it was always the same thing. And that is, how do you bring a way of thinking about work where you're in effect skewing the normal distribution and getting much more, and I don't mean harder work, I mean much more value added work out of every human being in the group. And, a real life example to me was when I went to work at Algoma Steel in a somewhat remote Northern Ontario location where, it wasn't easy to just simply, replace a whole bunch of people and try to go and recruit with money players, because although I loved living and working in Northern Ontario, not a lot of people necessarily shared that. Yet 5 years later, well, frankly, 3 years later, as the most profitable steel company per unit of production on the planet, I think even the board was stunned at the fact that there hadn't been that many people replaced. This same group of people seem to be just performing at a totally different level. Step change.
Mhm.
And I've seen that over and over again. And it's not magical to me anymore.
One of our long-term clients, who Dennis knows, who he brought on the board of his steel company, I remember after 2 months of working with him, when he took over a turnaround, he turned to one of his senior executives and said, because he wasn't getting his team to act accordingly, if I have to do your job for you, why do I need you? And that really got his attention.
So you guys have both mentioned union, non-union. We mentioned nonprofit before. We've talked a little about universality of this approach. Gerry, you, over your career, have you seen any type of business where strategic organization didn't fit?
Well, there's two answers to that question. The first answer is, one of my first big assignments was to work with the senior leadership of Social Security and the senior union leadership, who disagreed with what the Clinton-Gore policy giving union leadership a lot of control meant. And again, after 3 days, the union leadership said, okay, I get it. If we can see the executive leadership operating this way, then we agree we should be operating this way. So I've seen it work in private, I've seen it work in government, a little more complicated in nonprofits. I can talk about that later. Now, the question about when doesn't it work? And I would say about 50% of the time when we get brought in, it doesn't work because the CEO is not prepared to either learn about this, apply this, and to ensure that all the elements of the system, the training, the accountability are put in place. If the CEO doesn't get behind it in a serious way, we've actually fired a number of CEOs from our consultancy. We just can't help you if that's the way you want to do this.
Just on that last point, I also have introduced this to many people for a period of my life when I was doing some consulting. And it's a natural reflex for some CEOs to want to delegate this initiative, we'll call it, if it is the launch and rollout of using strategic organization principles as part of the foundation of turning around a business. The reflex is, well, I'm going to assign that to somebody. Maybe it's the senior HR person, maybe it's a special projects person. And, I used to work very hard to help them understand, you need to own this. This needs to be one of your 5 priorities. And that means you have got to lead by getting yourself up the curve. You've got to genuinely have enough curiosity around this to actually internalize it, recognizing, like all complex things, it takes practice. You won't be perfect, you will make mistakes. But the point is, if a CEO doesn't genuinely understand that this is foundational to being a CEO, the odds are higher, much higher, that it will not be successful. I still think deployment has value, but it will not become foundational to the way a business is run. And in turnarounds where you genuinely need step change, i.e. not just little gradual continuous improvement, I think any average competence CEO can achieve that. Real step change, meaning large increases in value in short periods of time, this is absolutely foundational. And if they don't own it, I honestly, I've never seen a situation where somebody can be successful.
What happens if I wind up half putting it in? Does it look any different than just a dysfunctional bureaucratic organization, or Is it?
Like I say, I believe every aspect of this body of knowledge has some accretive value. I.e., if you simply trained all the the individual leaders in an organization around how to set proper context, QQTR, defining the scope of the work they're accountable for, and discussing the timelines they have and the resources they have available to them, i.e., basic, good tactical managerial work, that will be helpful. And it'll be helpful to the people that have learned it and deployed it for the rest of their careers. So if you can get that simple a benefit installed, people will be better off. But for it all to work, the analogy, I'll go back to my mechanical engineering, you know, if anybody's ever heard the roar of a Ferrari engine in a Formula One, you don't need to be anything but having open ears and listening to that compared to the lawnmower when you do your lawn during the day. A high performance engine, you can't just get one or two or three of the components right. If you want to win Formula One, you need to have that whole system functioning in a certain way. And there are sporting analogies. You know, I was a Chicago Bulls fan when Michael Jordan was there. Jordan was probably one of the best basketball players that ever lived, but it was much more than that. They had probably the best coach that ever lived that
Excellent.
understood that in this structured organization of 5 people on a court, what role did each one need to play? What skills did they need to hone to then interact so that the sum of the parts was truly more powerful than any individual component? So if you want to build a high performance organization of any kind, and i.e., if your mission is serious, it's a mission that's critical, like winning the NBA championship or buying a big complex business and driving incremental value, you need a high performance work system. There's no way around it. So can you get some things? Are there collateral advantages and consequences even if you're not fully successful? Absolutely. But if you really want to win, it's a systematic approach. And there's no way around it that I've found in 35 years of working.
In the book, chapter 13, I included an article that I wrote about Denis. In the last 2 pages, I list the 6 attributes of the CEO that he or she needs to demonstrate to do exactly what Denis just said.
We have a question that I saw. They asked, what is your definition of high performance? And would you both share your views on this? You want to start with Gerry, and then we'll go to Denis?
Well, it seems to me there are 2 or 3 components to high performance. The first, as Denis just alluded to with his metaphor, that every employee is delivering the greatest amount of value he or she has the potential to deliver. But the success of the whole enterprise is not the sum of the individual successes of each individual performance, each individual employee. It has to do with the degree to which they're able to collaborate around the myriad of decisions and discover those decisions that will create the greatest incremental value for the organization. So it's high-performing people, high-performing teams and cross-functional processes, all aligned in a way using these engineering principles to, at the end of the day, deliver the maximum enterprise value the organization can yield. Denis, mine was a sort of a vague answer. I'm sure you can do a much more precise answer.
What Gerry said.
Okay.
As a practitioner of this, since the moment I was exposed to it when I met Gerry, I can tell you, you know it when you see it. And you know it as you're interacting with the individuals in an organization, as we do our due diligence when we look at target acquisitions, as an example. I'm really interested in the first and every interaction with the management team and listening to how each manager presents their aspect of the business. And you start to know it when you see it right there. As you're starting to size up the individual, as you're learning more about the business, you can take a step back at the right point when you've learned enough about the business, if you've learned enough about the industry, where you can see the economic potential with experience. Some illustration could be simple benchmarking. If this company has 18% EBITDA margins and the best in class in the sector has 26%, why? Right? So there are ways you can benchmark to understand the economic potential. And then as you're working through the business with each of these managers, as you work your way through the management team and have them talk about their contributions to the business, you can start to feel and describe, using this body of knowledge called strategic organization, where are the mismatches? Where are the right things being done? And how do you systematize and reinforce it if it's being done ad hoc? Where are the things that are being done inconsistently, not the best way, consistently? And most importantly, how do you get the structure of the organization right, the accountabilities right, and the right people in role so that you increase the probability of the best approach to every problem or opportunity you're interacting with? So it's hard to describe in its fulsome complexity, but you sure know it when you see it. And with this body of knowledge, it takes you beyond just gut feel. You know, I think I reported directly to one of the most successful CEOs of all time, Darwin Smith, ran Kimberly-Clark, 22% compounded total shareholder return over a rolling 22-year career.
Oh.
He did not understand a thing about strategic organization, but ironically, that's where I discovered Levinson as a result of happenstance. In the vault of the HR department, they used to send all of their high performers, their very young people, down to Boston for a week's training. And it was interesting, ironic in a way, where 10 years after interacting and working directly for this CEO, when I then get to meet Gerry and start to understand this body of knowledge, you started to understand how there are maybe a handful of great CEOs who didn't specifically have this body of knowledge, but they had developed through experience and through curiosity and reflection an innate understanding of what was needed. Extremely powerful empirical evidence that then supports this 60-year lifelong basket of work.
Sure, you look like you're about to say something.
Well,
I have about 2 minutes.
I'm just so pleased to have an opportunity to be on the stage with Denis and talk about how much he's learned from me, and I would say I've learned more from him. And our goal, and my goal with writing this book, is that we can propagate this knowledge and the courage to begin to learn and apply this knowledge. This is, at the end of the day, good common sense, but good common sense deployed systematically and systemically. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to make it accessible to people so they can apply it wherever they are in the organization and become true master practitioners of this strategic organizational approach.
Gerry, thank you. That was a great closing comment. We are at time, so I appreciate that. Denis, appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Very much. And for everyone that's on the call, we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to where you can find Gerry's book and where you can subscribe to future events. So thanks everybody for attending, and we will sign off for today.
Stay safe. Thank you so much.